Trinity Wall Street's commitment to a world of good includes offering service through its Faith in Action program to and with partners who span the globe. Trinity works in Burundi on building projects that help sustain the church in Africa, in Panama to improve the lives of young girls rescued from at-risk homes, in New Orleans, where the All Souls Episcopal community emerged in the neighborhood hardest hit by Hurricane Katrina, and with Our Children in the borough of Queens in New York City, which assists women in prison and those coming out of prison as they resume their roles as mothers. Trinity's congregation and staff volunteer to share in the work with our partners and find themselves transformed by the experience. And now, to introduce our panel, the director of Trinity Wall Street's Faith in Action program, the Reverend Matthew Hyde.
5 years ago, Trinity Church heard the call to extend its work out in the world, to work alongside partners, to get our hands dirty and our feet wet. And so, over the course of several years, the congregation and staff worked together to discern where we'd be. And now, New York, New Orleans, Panama, and Burundi are our mission and service partners. We chose them, but more importantly, they chose us. And so now we've been on more than 24 trips, 150 people, in every part of the planet, painting churches, teaching children to sing, working in the bayou of Louisiana, rebuilding houses, work we can do together. But more importantly, we do the deeper work of recognizing our interdependence, of being formed together, of being transformed through relationship. For the first time, we've gathered all of our partners here. And so this morning, we have a remarkable opportunity to have a deeper discussion about reconciliation, this ministry we share together in Christ. I'm honored to introduce our partners here this morning: Julio Murray, Bishop of Panama; Sister Tisa Fitzgerald, founder and executive director of Our Children; Dr. Jim Cooper, 17th rector of Trinity Church; Morris Thompson, Bishop of Louisiana; Westina Matthews Chatine, a member of Trinity's vestry and a mission and service traveler. Now, Westina plays a special role this morning. She is herself a recognized leader here in New York, nationally and globally. But she also represents the voice of Burundi. Archbishop Bernard Nadatori, Archbishop of Burundi, was with us, was called home on a family emergency. And Westina has been part of our work in Burundi. As a Weatherhead Fellow at Harvard, has published about work in Burundi and women in Burundi. So she has dual roles this morning. And finally, Jim Melchiori, a veteran traveler and our moderator. I'll invite Dr. Cooper to give us greetings.
Good morning, those here in the church sanctuary and those who will be coming online later. This particular panel will focus on reconciliation. Our Lord had many manifold ministries, teacher, preacher, healer, feeder, but I think way up at the top of the list is reconciler. And so that's our topic today, but not just a topic, it's our ministry day to day.
And so we begin our conversation about our shared ministry of reconciliation. Jim Melchiori.
Years ago, we had a pastor in Nashville who said that if there is one theme that runs through the entire 66 books of the Bible, that theme is reconciliation. Reconciliation, though, is a process, and it begins with a response to trauma, whether that is a natural disaster, whether that's a civil war, whether that's a military invasion, whether that's an arrest and an incarceration. So we're going to begin today with our panel and ask them to respond to that sense of the way reconciliation begins. And we're going to begin by mutual agreement with Bishop Julio Murray.
Thank you. Many of you have heard the story about what happened in Panama in the year 1989. For me, it was very, very special, for it happened on the 19th of December at 11:46 when the armed forces of the United States invaded Panama. 5,000 lives were lost in order to take out one, General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Too many lives were lost. Too much was at stake. But again, the price was paid so that democracy will come to be again in Panama. At that time, who were the most affected? The children, the women, the people who live in El Chorrillo, close by what used to be the Canal Zone area. A whole community was wiped out. And again, many will not agree. Over 5,000 people were killed. This event happened all over the country. For wherever there was a military installation governed by Panama was invaded. It was interesting, for the people came together, and there was a lot of support with one another. But also, there were times in which the people fought against each other, because some was in favor and some were against. Looting, living in insecurity, all-night patrolled. For some of us, it was risking to go into the communities where the people didn't have no food or water, to take food and water to them. It was a challenging time for the church. But again, it was a challenge to our mission of reconciliation and restoration. The church will always be present when these moments occur. It will be the first to get there, and it will be the last to leave. And what we need to install in this story is that our mission goes definitely in restoration and reconciliation, especially when the country is left polarized in the way in which we should carry on our endeavor as Christians. This happened 23 years ago, and we still feel the scars because we have decided that we will no longer have to go through a situation like this, but that we would look for ways in which to resolve our differences, no longer using the violence, no longer calling upon foreign strength or military groups to invade or to resolve what we can resolve on our own. So, as a response, we are using a different methodology to resolve conflict. And we are using the dialogue table, a table at which everyone has a voice. The church sees itself no longer as the voice of the voiceless, but the church sees itself as the one who articulates the space to make sure that all voices are present, because we believe that people need to have their own voice and claim their own position around the table.
Sister Tisa.
7 years ago, I was very happily living in one of our homes in Richmond Hill with 11 of our families. And it was a cold winter day in March. And we were all home because of a storm. And I was down in the kitchen talking with two of the families. We smelled smoke in the house. And eventually we knew we had to leave the house. But I knew when I left the front door of the house that there were still 4 families upstairs with babies. And again, my personal trauma of standing out in the street, really in my night attire, and the pastor running over and giving me a jacket, and some families across the street coming and giving me old sneakers to stand in as we watched firemen come. and realized that lives were at risk. And it just seemed like eternity while I watched cherry pickers, women who were supposedly going down the back staircase, back fire escape, ended up going back to the rooms, and the firemen out on the roof, and watching a mother and a baby huddle in the cold near the chimney. And I never prayed so hard in my life, and it was an experience of deep faith. I prayed that the families would be safe. In the end, we all were safely removed from the house, and yet we stood, and I think of this so often with the trauma of people go through Hurricane Sandy and 9/11, that you were standing there with your life and really nothing else, seemingly nothing else. And we all took refuge in the church, and we gathered in prayer, really for the safety, and it was prayers through tears, and gratitude for lives saved. And in the subsequent days, we realized that the fire was started by carelessness of one of the residents and a candle. And all, dealing with the anger and the would'ves and the should'ves, and realizing that we now were homeless, and looking to people's resources and goodness to help us survive this tragedy and relocate and become whole again, but at the same time dealing with the fact that this was one among us who had caused this. And it had caused many, many moments and many times, and even to today, even after when Hurricane Sandy happened, people talked about that experience in reflection, and that the thing that got us through and the healing that took place really came through the power of support, that we had become a family to each other. We all were happily relocated, and the stuff of our life came back. That was the easy part, but it was the inner healing and the inner acceptance of what had happened in those days. And I often think of that when I go to prison and I listen to the trauma of the women that I work with. I sit with a woman who has experienced the trauma of her yes, she did a wrong, she was in prison, but she has no idea where her children are. And I can understand with a listening ear and a listening heart better, I think, today, after experiencing that, where everything was gone from me, and helping them rebuild their lives. And the stories that they tell are unique to them and their children, and the pain that we can move toward reconciliation.
It was helpful to have our moderator challenge us with that beginning point of trauma. So the one I would describe is one that I am still in the midst of. In the early days of Occupy Wall Street, when we would journey to Zuccotti Park and have conversations and be focused on the issues and conversations about the issues, we seemed to be partnered in a healthy way. And Trinity's time at Trinity Institute, Washington Roundtable, Wall Street Dialogues have all been aligned, for the most part, with the issues that we would see at Zuccotti Park or on posters and during protests around the Occupy Wall Street movement. However, there came a time when Trinity's tactics, as opposed to philosophies and issues, differed with a portion of those in Occupy Wall Street at such time as a portion of them chose to occupy some of Trinity's property. And out of that, enormous conflict took place. And I think reconciliation has a chance when we live into the possibility of paradox. When we live into the possibility that we can agree on some things, but not all things, all the time. For me, the high point of that intense period, the positive high point of that intense period, occurred because my wife and I and others had engaged in late-night conversations in the parks and out here along Wall Street and in the Zuccotti Park, and we had begun to come to know some people. And that helps, to begin to know people and not just issues and tactics. So the high point for me was a sort of like this gathering called the Occupy Teach-In. And there were those who were very directly Occupy Wall Street, and there are those who were professors and theologians and so forth. We differed on these things, but there was a connecting point. And the parts that we agreed on, we could move ahead with. We could begin to establish some relationships and look beyond the presumptions and projections we had about each other's motivations. And so when that personal contact began, that was a sign of hope. We aren't there yet. This one is unresolved. And there are parts that are still left sort of dangling. And learning to live with that tension, with that unfinished business, I think puts us in a better position to move the needle toward reconciliation and alignment.
Bishop Thompson.
When I arrived in the Diocese of Louisiana, the oil spill had happened right off the bat. And it affected thousands and thousands of acres and people who made their lives off of fishing, shrimping. And it really did affect them in ways that I began to learn and listen to their stories. And then a couple of months later was the 5th anniversary of Katrina. And again, I began to hear stories from people. But I had been hearing stories all along of how Katrina had affected them. And I sat there and just listened that whole night of their stories. And not just the stories of how they were moved out of their homes, but what the storm uncovered, all kinds of issues. And how do we recover from that? And they even differed on how they should recover among those who lived in that area. But to listen to that, how do we move forward and how do we rebuild a community that once was thriving and now it is not? Once the streets were lined with businesses are no longer there. So how do we recover? And I began to hear this is going to be a long time of recovery. This isn't something that we get over in a couple of years, 10 years. Whole neighborhoods are gone, but more than that. And so All Souls, which was not there before the storm, is created out of the mud and the muck, where people can come and hear good news of hope. And so for me, reconciliation is just listening to the stories, listening and listening and listening until issues begin to surface. And as we listen to those stories and those issues, what is the body saying of how we move forward?
Dr. Matthews?
So I want to give the personal regrets and good wishes from Archbishop Bernard. He was so sorry to not be here with you all today. And if you've ever seen him, he's a big man, and he's strong, and he's vibrant, and I'm little, so I've got some big shoes to fill. So I have notes, so I hope you'll give me that grace. And some of you may know that the Archbishop was the representative for the country's churches in the peace negotiations at the ending of the Civil War, which officially ended in 2006. So I think about national reconciliation, Jim, with your questions, such as Burundi has been experienced since the end of the war, although there's still disruptions sporadically throughout the country, and certainly that is a response to a traumatic event. In this case, it would be genocide. We hear about Rwanda. We don't hear about Burundi and the genocide that occurred there. But I believe it is the personal reconciliation, which we're beginning to hear some of that from my other panelists, that I witness in Burundi, that while it may not be a fast response, it is going to be the long-lasting response, that individual level. One pastor shared with me in Burundi, a young pastor, that he was almost killed 5 times, twice by his own people. Another pastor shared that when he was young, his little brother, who was 2 years old, was poisoned by the next-door neighbor. And when the pastor was 6 years old, his father, who was a missionary, was killed. His sister was killed. Another sister was mutilated very badly. And yet both of these pastors continue to preach the gospel to everyone, and to love and to worship and to pray with them. Or as the Archbishop Bernard asked on the first day in Matana when we met with them and his team, he said, when we get to truth, what shall we do with this truth? What shall we do with it? We must move on. And I think that would be my response then to the question of trauma. It is about the individual reconciliation and the commitment to move on.
Trinity Wall Street has been very active in recent years in aiding communities emerging from conflict. And I'd like to begin this next section by directing something to Dr. Cooper, who, of course, has supported that work. But then in October of 2012, we had a major superstorm that came through. And now all of a sudden, we have disaster and trauma in our backyard. Dr. Cooper, where do you see reconciliation as part of that?
Again, back to the trauma theme. When that assault occurs, there's sort of two directions for humanity to go, or individuals. One to dig in and look out for yourself and fight with others. There's so many resources because of the processes that Trinity has developed through the tsunami and then Katrina and then Haiti, the earthquake, kind of the same things. Not being presumptuous, but being available, not going to partner too soon so that you're hosted by people who are not capable of hosting you. But in each of those disasters, there are forces at work that have to come into to balance with each other. That it begins with looking out for what's closest to you, what you know the immediate need is, and then that's balanced by the system trying to right itself. So there's always that complexity of how you do the local and yet still understand that the local is part of the whole. You move one part, move one part of the community, and it affects the entire community.
May I ask you something about that, though? The way that Sandy affected the people in Louisiana is being seen now because it is so important that the people of New Orleans area respond. And a little town of Slidell, which is in our diocese, has already sent things that they know that you will need right off the bat in your recovery. And so when one is hurt, the body responds, and you have responded, and people around the world have responded to Katrina and other things. And so the people of Louisiana believe it's their time to respond, even in the midst of our own recovery. It's important that we again listen to your needs and not overreact, because you're right. You don't want to rush in before anyone can receive, but to be prepared to give back in this relationship of reconciliation, of listening and learning and being with.
I want to say one more thing, especially Bishop Julio, who came to New York on a trip that has been long planned and turned out to coincide with the superstorm, and on Saturday was actually out cutting drywall in a flooded home in Staten Island. Bishop, I think there's something profound there, and perhaps you could share your thoughts on what it meant to serve in that very direct way in another place.
Because we think it's important to meet the people where they are and walk with them in the process. And if this means that you have to get in the mud, roll up your sleeves and get in the mud, and if that is needed, then that's what we're going to do. And I think we need to be sensitive enough to be able to walk alongside our brothers and sisters who are in need. Yeah, we can do a lot of praying. We can do a lot of interceding. But sometimes you really need to get in the mud with the people and work with them and walk with them as we can, walk to a safer place. So we saw ourselves in that role because That's what the church in Panama is accustomed to do. That's what the church in Latin America is accustomed to doing. When there are times of crisis, it's interesting to see how everybody wants to come in and help. And when the crisis is over, where does all this help go? We have been fortunate that when we have been in need, Trinity have been there. But it's time to also walk with those who are in need along with Trinity and be that helping hand in some other place. When I got to Staten Island, all the rubble and you saw the volunteers, but you also saw people that were cleaning out their basements, and I took a picture of a sign that says, "We need help in such and such a building." And we try to find this place, and we try to make ourselves available. We became those new signs of hope for these people. And why not? If we are understanding what reconciliation is all about, it's getting involved. It's being part of the solution. And at times sometimes it's just the presence. But other times, we need the hands.
This leads to a question that we should probably explore with all of us here, and that is the question of how do we stay true to what we believe in the midst of trauma, in the midst of disaster, when human need is almost minute by minute? How do we see the large picture of reconciliation and recovery in the crucible of that trauma? Sister, for example.
I have to take you to my backyard, which is across the bridge in Queens. 27 years ago, the Ministry of Our Children was really born in its work with children providing a home for children whose mothers were in prison. Over the course of the years, that grew to include the mothers, realizing that children need stability, and the mothers were victims as children without all of the services and love and trauma and violence that they were exposed to. So the mission of Our Children now is to provide homes for mothers coming out of prison so they can reunite with children and rebuild their lives. And all of the services support that effort. 17 years ago, when we first came into the Long Island City neighborhood, we came quietly. We sort of went into a convent. We didn't make a lot of noise. We didn't want the neighborhood to know we were there because to safeguard the children and the stigma that is on incarcerated in prison and all of those things that are out there in our society. But over the course of our growth, we have become a very vital part of that neighborhood. So 17 years moving forward, we were ready for housing, for permanent housing. We were very excited because there was an abandoned building in the neighborhood. We got it from the city for $1. We looked for all the resources to rebuild that and create 8 permanent apartments for our families. Great excitement. And the most excitement came from the women because this was going to be the first permanent building, really in America, that housed ex-offenders who had rebuilt their lives. So they looked at it as very proudly, we can do it with support. And everything was going fine, and I remember coming back from the building and going into the local bodega, and I see these big signs plastered. Don't let it happen. We don't want these type of people in our neighborhoods. And I'm saying, I'm reading it. They're talking about us. And I realized we had to go to the community board for approval of the building, and our neighbors around got wind of this, of what the plan was for this ugly building that had been dilapidated and eyesore for 18 years. And I was crushed. I remember going back said to the guy, I'm taking this, and taking the flyer, going back to my office, rallying the women who were there and the staff and saying, this is us. They're talking about us. You know? And again, the pain that was experienced because they had the word prostitutes, drug offenders, people who didn't care. Oh, it was just every negative name was on this flyer. And the women said, we're going to show them. I said, no, please don't come. I was afraid of what would the negative they would experience. And I was protecting them as any mother would a child, saying, no, it's okay, we'll handle this. I was the third one to get up, and I got up with the architect, and I went to the mic, and all of a sudden I turned around, and in comes a stream of my women, a stream. 25 women strong came and sat in the back as I went to the mic, and I got a little emotional, as you can imagine, and I gave my pitch as to why we are good neighbors, why we have been good neighbors, and then I sat down, and of course then they opened it up to the public. And there were some very negative things said about, not about the experience with our children and our women, but about what's out there in society, about people who really haven't been rehabbed and haven't been rehabilitated and all the negative, on and on. And a big focus on men. What would happen, or the men that this, like everyone, if you have one woman, you're going to have 10 men at the door. I mean, every stereotype that could have been said was said. And I just took a deep breath, and one by one, my women got up to the microphone. And they spoke their stories of their life, yes, admitting life had been negative for them, and they had made terrible choices that affected their children, but they were asking for an opportunity of reconciliation with a community that they had come to know, to love, and to be part of. One spoke about joining the school board, the local public school board, and how important education was for her child because she didn't have it herself. So all that being said, I sat down and I remember saying, oh dear God, the vote is coming. Unanimous for us, 40-0 for our children's building. And that was a moment I said, it wasn't about me, it was about the experience of community building. It's just giving people the ability to be who they are and to live their life with the God-given gifts they have, no matter what their past is. And it's humbling for me. That word is humbling, because I stand in awe of them, because I don't know if I could do what my women are called to do in terms of rebuilding a life. And
I'm going to answer the question a little differently. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge and witness God's perfect timing, because last night we had more than 100 of those who've gone on the missions from Trinity to these various locations. But God's perfect timing is that the leaders are here when we're experiencing our own crisis. And so we're learning in a very different way, and we're listening in a very different way about how do you reconcile and how do you overcome and how do you survive. So I just thank you, God. I just wanted to take that little commercial. So I would say, though, that to your question, though, about how do you hold on to your values in the crucible, I love that word, crucible of the trauma. You know, I was down here on 9/11 and ended up running down 33 flights and over the Brooklyn Bridge in 45 minutes. Jackie Joyner-Kerson's got nothing on me. And then preparing for Hurricane Sandy, you know, they were saying, it's coming, it's coming. And each time, my cry was the same, save me, Lord, save me. And I wasn't talking about physical salvation, you know, because as much as this personal salvation, I believe in life after death, so okay, whatever it is, but it is, God, I'm here, forgive me, reconciliation, save me. And it was that faith and that belief that I held on to in that crucible. And when I was in Burundi, now Burundi's one of the 10 poorest countries in the world. They had nothing. Let me tell you, nothing. And we would go into the small homes or wherever they were, and they would say, they didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for anything. They said, pray for me, and I will pray for you. And I want to let you know, in Burundi, they pray. No, listen to me. They pray. They pray a long time. And when you get done, you know you've been prayed for. And I know Desiree, who you'll hear from later, when he went out to Staten Island and he rolled up his sleeves and did everything, but he said, but I thought we came to pray. Because that's what they do. That's what they understand. When you have nothing, what do you hold on to? Your faith. And so it's the Bible and prayer that we see in Burundi. And we can learn a lot from that because we're Episcopalians, so we have the Book of Common Prayer. We don't, not so much the Bible, but they know the Word.
John, the questions you asked, Jim, sort of keep driving us deeper and deeper. It's one thing for me to hold my principles when I go into an area of conflict, but I also need to be willing in that area to allow them to be challenged. So there are two iconic statements at St. Paul's. One is, I too was a volunteer coming up to Trinity during post 9/11. And there was the banner from Oklahoma City. It was so important to have heard from those who had been through this kind of thing. They knew what it's about, and their banner said, "We're with you, and we love you." That affirms, sort of strengthens my resolve and my principles. But there's another one. Father, forgive. The community across the nails, and I can't see that being carved in granite across the street from St. Paul's Chapel. It is carved in granite, maybe someday, but it is in the theology and context of the chapel.
Several years ago, we were trying to put together a service of reconciliation for veterans, and I won't go into the whole story, but I called General Hal Moore, who book, We Were Soldiers. It was one of the first major battles in Vietnam. So I called him to see if he would come and speak at the cathedral. And he says, I know a little bit about reconciliation. The commanding officer of Vietnam that I fought against, I've spent many nights in his home. And he has spent many nights in my home. And I spoke at his funeral. So I know a little bit about reconciliation, he said. And it all began, he was beginning to put a book together, and he wanted to make sure he had the facts straight. And from that began a very, very close relationship that he said was very sad when the other general died. Reconciliation, and maybe one day it will be in stone, Father, forgive. Over a period of time when we know the stories of other people that are not much different than our own, we can begin to forgive slowly.
One of the things we learned from the experience in 1989 as the church played her part in teaching that Jesus came to be about life and life abundant, it also opened up the idea to the reconciliation that needs to be there, the truth-telling that needs to be there, and the formation of commissions of truth. Now, when you have a commission of truth or a commission for reconciliation, you're going to be looking for somebody to blame. But what was important at the time was to bring people to the table to have them regain their dignity and their trust in one another and their trust in God. So we had not only one reconciliation commission, but after that, we learned that, we could really find solutions in a way in which less lives were lost. At the dialogue table, you have people who represent the government, and you have people who represent the workers. The church has been called to be at the table. The church in Panama still maintains this very active role, but the people are the ones who recognize the role of the church to be transparent, to be truthful, and to be there walking in the journey with the people. We sit at the table with the people because they recognize that the work that we're doing, the mission that we're doing, is calling for reconciliation and restoration.
We have several of our partners in the audience, and we would like to get a sense, a little snapshot of where reconciliation fits into your context. I'd like to begin with Father Linnell Wright, who for 4 years was the dynamic vicar of All Souls Episcopal Church in the Lower Ninth Ward. Father Wright, when you're dealing with something like Katrina and people losing their homes and all of the logistical needs, show us where reconciliation fits in to that context.
Thank you, Jim. Reconciliation has been absolutely huge in the lower Ninth Ward and in New Orleans generally, but particularly in our community in the lower Ninth Ward, there are cases and people where people had not been exposed to those of different racial groups, specifically where black people, there was absolute distrust of whites and believing that, well, they are for themselves, they are the devils, and are not to be considered as our friends. But as time went on, what happened is that love and reconciliation take place. And, you know, Jim, those kinds of stories, and in our lives at All Souls, we have seen the larger community, predominantly white people who have come into our community, kids who have come in droves from Marquette University, who we have developed a great relationship with. They come there 4 times a year. I can't walk through that building without seeing places and things where those of you, not just them, but about where Trinity Wall Street has come and have emptied themselves, have befriended us, have taken our kids in their arms and made a huge, huge difference in our lives. Reconciliation takes so many forms and takes so many shapes, but what has happened is that as a Christian community and being in the lower Ninth Ward where people had never heard of the Episcopal Church, Episcopalians, who are they? But you see out of that chaos and of Katrina, when those of you have come, and when we were on the street, the prior vicar was on the street passing out water and cleaning supplies and loving people and praying with people, that's the power of God. That is where we have seen and how we've been reconciled, and we are so graced by it. Thank you.
And it sounds to me as though really reconciliation comes through relationship, the 2 R words there. And thank you for that, Father Wright. One other guest with us, one of our partners from Burundi. And I'd like to just take a minute or two for Desiree Muhumbere to stand up and tell us a little bit about what reconciliation looks like in Burundi, emerging from a very difficult and very long civil war.
Burundi is a small country situated in Central Africa, and it's a small country with 28,736 square kilometers. It's a country highly populated with about 9 million of people. It got its independence in 1962. Due to colonialism legacy, we experienced ethnic group conflict between Hutu and Tutsi. So people killed each other, and because of that, about 1 million of people became refugees in Tanzania and other neighboring countries. We had so many widows, of course, orphans, and other bad things. There were about 500,000 people who were killed, and most of them, they were in both ethnic groups, Hutu and the Tutsis. What is the church is trying to do now in terms of reconciliation? As Bishop Panama said, one of the most approach that we are using is dialogue. We are trying to bring both ethnic groups, those who stayed in the country and those who are coming from outside of the country, to sit together, try to discuss what are the root causes of the conflict. What can we do to solve this problem? What can we do to stay in peace instead of fighting or killing each other? The church is the place where people feel more comfortable through prayers and other in-kind assistance. We are also trying to organize communities into self-help groups, into associations, so they can run together and income-generating activities, and people can discuss, can share, can try to for cohabitation again. It is through those groups that people can discuss, can share, can see how they can live pacifically. But it's not easy to know who killed your family members. Instead of being a method of reconciling people, it may be another situation when people can be in insecurity, and people will try to revenge. So we request your prayers. Finally, we would like to thank Trinity Church for the partnership, for the accompaniment. Please continue to pray for us. Continue to pray for Burundians. Continue to pray for the church in Burundi. We are having too much to do in terms of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we heard, it's difficult. It's a long process. That's the nature of reconciliation, and it's such a rich discussion. It's a shame that we are running out of time. But I would like to ask each of the panelists, and I'm going to talk like those network people now, saying 30 seconds, okay? 30 seconds each, to speak to what Desiree was mentioning, the difficulty, the fact that reconciliation is a long process. How do we find the resilience to stay with it? Westina, do you want to start?
I'll read it. How's that? So when it looks like you are reaching irreconcilable differences in your broken relationships, remember God's love reigns eternal. Forgiveness is the key. Reconciliation is the goal. And love is always, always, always the answer.
Bishop Thompson?
I would say the same thing, that love, reconciliation is about love. It's about staying in the relationship with the other and recognizing our own brokenness and keep talking and keep staying in that relationship and praying for.
Dr. Cooper?
For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, until death us do part. That's not just for those married. It's for our relationship with all humanity.
Sister
For
Tisa?
me, it's carving out periods of solitude and reflection, whether that be at the end of a busy day, to look back on the faces of success and hope that I've encountered, and to really dig deeper into my relationship with a loving God.
If we understand the work of reconciliation as a response to what love is all about, love will always have to take on concrete actions. And as we do these concrete actions based on love, they have to be well informed. So if we understand what Jesus is all about, we need to be able to go to the table with the understanding of what the next person is all about. For that next person is also made in the image of God, just as we are.
Now I'll call upon the Deputy for Anglican Partnerships, Canon Benjamin Masaki Lobega.
I would like to begin with the words of Doris Akers in one of the spirituals, where it says, "There's a sweet, sweet spirit, and I know it's the Lord's Spirit." What we've heard from our brothers and sisters echoes what I see around the communion, more especially in Africa. In Sudan, Archbishop Deng is actively involved in reconciling communities. you go to Burundi, you go to Kenya. And this past September, the rector and I and members of our vestry visited Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And one of the words that came out from Archbishop Desmond Tutu was to thank Trinity for accompanying South Africa, for accompanying the Anglican Communion around the world for the ministry of reconciliation. Many of us believed that South Africa, it would be a bloodbath. But through active engagement with one another, apartheid regime, do you know what the name they called Desmond Tutu? He was known as the little devil because he was actively reconciling people, both black and white, colored, name it. Without that, we cannot. And also, it means engaging with one another. The moment we walk away, there is no reconciliation. We have to stay at the table. And I remember the words of Archbishop Bernard Ntauturi yesterday. He said, Benjamin, Burundi is committed to staying at the table. We may disagree, and we are not going to agree, as the rector said, yes, you agree on this, but there are some things you will never see eye to eye, but to remain at the table and be engaged.
Thank you to our panel today for all that you shared with us, all that you shared in terms of your stories of the listening hearts and resilience to help us walk the road, to help the church be the first to get there and the last to leave as we move from trauma to reconciliation.